He wore a faded blue cap pulled low over his eyebrows, the kind you'd buy at a hardware store for $3 and forget about by Tuesday. His coat was threadbare at the cuffs, his shoes scuffed but clean, and in his lap he held a crumpled paper bag, slightly damp at the bottom, smelling faintly of citrus. I didn't look at him twice. On the 7:15 a.m. downtown bus, everyone's a ghost until proven otherwise. We were just two strangers sharing a bench seat on a drizzly Tuesday. The windows fogged from the warmth of too many bodies pressed too close, the overhead lights flickering like a tired heartbeat. I was wrapped in my own exhaustion, overnight shift at the clinic still clinging to my bones. A text from my sister buzzing unanswered in my pocket about tuition deadlines, and the damp hem of my coat brushing against scuffed linoleum. I kept my eyes on the book in my lap, though I hadn't turned a page in 10 minutes. The man beside me didn't speak, didn't sigh, didn't shuffle or cough or complain about the cold like most of the regulars did. He just sat, quiet as a held breath, watching the rain trace crooked paths down the glass. Then, without warning, he shifted. Not much, just enough to reach into the inside pocket of his coat. My guard went up instinctively. Years of city life teach you that sudden movements mean trouble. But what he pulled out wasn't a weapon or a wallet. It was a folded sheet of thick, cream-colored paper, the kind that feels expensive even when it's creased from being carried too long. He didn't look at me, just placed it gently on the seat between us, as if setting down a teacup on fine china. Then he tapped it once with a knuckle deliberate, steady, and turned his gaze back to the window. I froze, because in that stillness, in the angle of his jaw, in the way his thumb bore the same faint scar my mother used to trace when she cried about him, I finally saw it. My grandfather, not the black and white portrait in the old family albums, not the stern industrialist in the newspaper clippings my mother kept tucked in a shoebox under her bed. This was him, aged, softened, diminished by time and regret, but unmistakable. Harold Winthrop, the man who'd disowned my mother for marrying a schoolteacher, the man who'd built a textile empire on silence and steel, the man who hadn't spoken to us in 23 years. My breath hitched. I didn't move to touch the paper. I couldn't. He finally turned his head. His eyes, still the same sharp gray I remembered from childhood glimpses, met mine. Not with arrogance, not with pity, but with something raw and trembling. Hope. You've grown into her, he said, voice rough like gravel wrapped in velvet. Your mother, she'd be proud. Then, as if the weight of that sentence had used up all his courage, he reached into the paper bag and pulled out a single orange. He peeled it slowly, methodically, the citrus scent cutting through the bus's stale air. He offered me half, just like he used to do when I was 5, before everything shattered. But it was the paper between us that held the real offering. I didn't know it yet, but that folded sheet was a last will and testament amended, signed, and waiting for me. And in that moment, on a bus full of strangers, the man who'd erased us chose to remember me. not as punishment, not as charity, but as family. And that single, silent act would unravel everything I thought I knew about inheritance, forgiveness, and the quiet, devastating cost of pride. For the longest time, I told myself I didn't care, that the name Winthrop meant nothing to me, that the gilded portraits, the marble-floored estate on Cypress Hill, the whispered rumors of offshore accounts and summer yachts, all of it belonged to a different universe, one that had slammed its doors shut before I'd even learned to walk. My mother stopped saying his name when I was 8, not out of bitterness, exactly, but because saying it out loud made the grief too real. Some people, she'd say while folding laundry, her voice soft but firm, confuse control for love. And so I learned early. Love shouldn't come with conditions, certainly not with ledgers. After she died, just 2 years after my father's sudden heart attack, I buried whatever curiosity I had about him under work, responsibility, and sheer survival. I was 22, with a nursing certification and a 17-year-old sister clinging to the edge of panic, and no one was coming to save us. Not him, not the aunts who'd vanished from our lives like smoke. I took the overnight shift at St. Marlo's ER because it paid 15 cents more an hour, and I never missed a day. Not when my back ached from lifting patients, not when my hands shook from too much coffee and not enough sleep. Not even the night I turned 25 alone in a studio apartment with a frozen pizza and a birthday card from my sister that said, "You're the only parent I've ever needed." I told myself that was enough. That dignity wasn't in bank statements or ancestral homes. It was in showing up, in paying your bills, in looking your sister in the eye and saying, "We're okay," even when you weren't. And for years, that conviction held, until that morning on the bus, seeing him not as a myth or a monster, but as a frail old man carrying oranges like an apology. He didn't know how to speak. It cracked something open inside me. Not anger, not yet. Something quieter, heavier. The ache of a question I'd never allowed myself to ask. Why did you leave us? And worse, did you ever wonder if we made it? I went home that day and stood in front of the bathroom mirror, still in my damp coat, and stared at my own face, the same high cheekbones, the same stubborn set to the jaw my mother said I got from him. For the first time, I didn't flinch. I just wondered if he could sit beside me after 23 years of silence. What else had he been wrong about? Maybe it's naive to think one moment can rewrite a lifetime of absence. But in that silence on the bus, something shifted, not because he offered me wealth, but because he finally offered me recognition. And after years of being told, directly or indirectly, that my family wasn't enough for his world being seen felt like the most radical inheritance of all. If you've ever been written out of someone's story for loving the wrong person, for being too loud or too quiet, for not fitting into their version of legacy, drop an tangerine in the comments. You don't need their name on your birth certificate to know your worth. But sometimes, It helps to have the papers to prove it. The bus always smelled the same at this hour: stale coffee, wet wool, and the faint, metallic tang of the handrails worn smooth by years of tired hands. Rain tapped a slow rhythm against the windows, blurring the city into watercolor streaks of gray and neon. Outside, people hurried under umbrellas, faces tucked into collars, eyes fixed on the next stop, the next worry, the next deadline. Inside, time moved differently, slower, heavier, like the air itself was holding its breath. He sat beside me, this man who'd once commanded boardrooms with a glance, now folded into a seat meant for someone half his age. His posture was careful, almost deferential, as if he didn't deserve the space he occupied. His hands, once capable of signing checks that could buy a house, rested gently on the paper bag in his lap, fingers tracing the seams like he was counting stitches in a prayer shawl. And that smell, oranges, not the sharp, commercial kind from a plastic container, but the rich, sun-warmed scent of fruit just peeled. The kind my mother used to slice for me on Sunday mornings before the world got complicated. To everyone else on that bus, he was invisible. Just another elder making his way downtown, maybe to a clinic, maybe to a park bench, maybe nowhere at all. But to me, he was a ghost stepping out of a locked room I'd long since boarded up. I studied him sideways, the way his ear still had that small, crooked fold I remembered from childhood photos, the same one my sister had inherited. The way he tilted his head when listening, as if giving silence its due respect. These were not the traits of a tyrant. They were the quiet markers of a man who'd once been someone's son, someone's brother, someone's father, before pride turned him to stone. The windows were fogged from the collective exhale of 20 strangers, and I watched my own breath cloud the glass beside his reflection. In that hazy mirror, our profiles almost lined up: his sharp, weathered lines against my softer ones, generations separated by silence, but joined by bone and blood. And in that moment, I realized the truth I'd spent years denying. I hadn't stopped missing him. I just stopped letting myself admit it. Because underneath all the anger, underneath the righteous armor of "I don't need him," there had always been a child who wondered, what if he'd stayed? What if he'd held my hand at my father's funeral? What if he'd asked about my nursing exams? What if he'd just shown up? The oranges were the motif, the thread that tied then to now. Every month, like clockwork, a box would arrive at our old house when I was little. No note, no return address, just a crate of Valencia oranges, perfectly ripe, nestled in straw. My mother would sigh, peel one slowly, and say, "He remembers." And for a while, that was enough. Until it was. Until the boxes stopped the year she married Dad, and the silence that followed was louder than any gift could ever be. Now here he was, offering me half an orange on a city bus like nothing had changed. Like 23 years hadn't passed in a desert of his own making. But things had changed. I had changed. And the man beside me wasn't the all-powerful patriarch of family legend. He was just a man. Frail, regretful, trying in his clumsy, lay-tower way, to say the words he'd buried for decades. I didn't take the orange right away. Not because I didn't want it, but because accepting it felt like opening a door I wasn't sure I could close again. And somewhere beneath the hum of the engine and the patter of rain, I heard the quiet creak of that door beginning to swing. My mother never spoke of him with venom. That was the thing that haunted me most. Even after the letters stopped coming, after the invitations dried up, after the day she came home from his estate with red-rimmed eyes and a single suitcase containing her childhood jewelry, she never cursed his name. Instead, she'd say things like, "He believes love is something you earn," or "he thinks vulnerability is weakness," as if explaining his cruelty made it less personal, as if understanding it could keep me from becoming him. She met my father at a community theater rehearsal, a man who taught 7th grade history by day and played piano in dive bars by night. He wore corduroys and quoted Whitman unironically, and he held her hand like it was the most precious thing in the world. To my grandfather, that was treason. Not because Dad lacked ambition, he had plenty, but because he lacked pedigree. No trust fund, no country club membership, no generational armor, just a decent heart and calloused fingers from tuning old pianos. And to Harold Winthrop, heart wasn't collateral. The rift didn't happen overnight. It was a slow erosion, missed birthdays, forgotten holidays, then outright silence. But what I didn't learn until much later was that even as he cut her off publicly, he never stopped paying for my tuition at St. Catherine's Academy. Every semester, like clockwork, the bursar's office received a wire transfer from an anonymous donor. I thought it was a scholarship. Mom let me believe that. Only after she died did I find the old bank statements tucked in her cedar chest, labeled not under his name, but under a shell trust, the Cyprus Educational Fund. The payments stopped abruptly the month after Dad's funeral. At the time, I assumed it was another act of punishment, kicking us while we were down. But the truth was far more tragic. His second wife, Aliner's much younger, far more cunning niece, had filed for divorce after his heart bypass surgery. During the proceedings, she froze all liquid assets, citing risk of dissipation. For 3 years, he was effectively powerless, his fortune locked in legal limbo while we scraped by, selling furniture, moving into a 2-bedroom apartment above a laundromat, eating pasta 3 nights a week. He tried to reach out once, a letter returned unopened because we changed addresses and never updated the old estate. By the time he regained control of his trust, I was in nursing school, my sister in high school, and the silence between us had calcified into something that felt permanent. He told me all of this weeks later, in a voice thin as parchment, his hands trembling around a teacup in Aunt Aliner's sunroom. "I thought you knew," he whispered. "I thought you chose not to forgive me." And in that moment, I realized the cruelest twist wasn't his abandonment. It was the mutual misunderstanding that kept us apart. He believed we'd rejected his quiet help. We believed he'd abandoned us completely. 2 truths, both partial, both devastating, orbiting each other in the dark for decades. Now, sitting on that bus, watching rain slide down the window like tears the sky had finally allowed itself to shed, I understood. His presence beside me wasn't just about giving. It was about asking, "Did you know I tried? Did you know I never stopped watching from afar? Did you know I've been waiting for a sign that it wasn't too late?" The tragedy wasn't that he'd been cruel. The tragedy was that he'd been trapped by his own pride, yes, but also by circumstance, by illness, by a system that lets wealth become a cage as easily as a crown. And now, with time running out and his body failing, he wasn't offering me an inheritance. He was offering me a chance to rewrite the ending, not for him, but for us. For the mother who loved him and the daughter who never stopped wondering if she was enough. But time doesn't care about second chances. It only cares about what you do with the moments you're given. And this one, the smell of oranges, the weight of the folded will, the quiet tremor in his voice, was slipping through my fingers like sand. I had to decide, would I let the past keep me silent? Or would I finally say the words I'd buried for 23 years? "I remember the oranges," I said softly, still staring out the window. He didn't reply, but his hand, resting on the seat between us, turned slightly palm up like an offering, or a plea. Aunt Eliner's parlor smelled of bergamot and beeswax, the kind of scent that clings to old money, not because it's trying to impress, but because it simply never learned how to be anything else. Sunlight streamed through tall, lace-curtained windows, catching dust motes like tiny, suspended memories. She sat in a wingback chair that probably predated the Great Depression, her spine straight, her silver hair coiled in a neat chignon, her hands folded over a teacup so delicate it looked like it might dissolve if held too tightly. At 89, she moved slowly, but her mind was a steel trap. Every name, every date, every unspoken grievance cataloged with the precision of a librarian who'd witnessed too much family drama to ever be surprised again. I'd called her the night after the bus ride, voice shaking, half convinced I'd hallucinated the whole thing. She answered on the second ring, as if she'd been waiting. "I've been expecting this call," she said simply. No preamble, no feigned shock, just the quiet certainty of someone who'd long ago accepted that truth, no matter how buried, always finds its way to the surface. When I arrived at her townhouse the next afternoon, still wearing my scrubs, still carrying the folded will in a manila envelope like a sacred relic, she didn't offer pleasantries. She poured tea, gestured to the chair opposite her, and said, "He's been trying to find you for months. Ever since he got his affairs back in order after that wretched divorce." Her voice was calm, but her eyes held a depth of sorrow I hadn't expected. "He thought you'd want nothing to do with him. And honestly, given how he behaved, who could blame you?" Then she reached into the drawer of the side table and pulled out a single sheet of paper, sealed in a clear protective sleeve. It was a notarized addendum to his trust, dated just 6 weeks earlier, witnessed by 2 attorneys, and initialed in his looping, slightly shaky script. At the bottom, in bold type, primary beneficiary designation, Eleanor Marie Winthrop, née Carter, hereby affirms the reinstatement of Isla Winthrop Ramos, daughter of Catherine Winthrop, to full residual interest, contingent upon verifiable in-person acknowledgement. My hands trembled as I took it. The paper felt heavier than it should have, weighted with decades of silence, with my mother's quiet resilience. With every night, I'd cried myself to sleep wondering if I'd ever be enough for the family I barely knew. He wanted to see you as you are, Aunt Eleanor said, her voice softening. Not as the child he lost in his pride, but as the woman you've become. Strong, capable, kind. He's watched you from a distance for years, through newspaper clippings your old high school sent, through a discreet inquiry to your nursing board. He never interfered, never wanted to disrupt your life, but he needed to know if there was still a bridge left to cross. She paused, stirring her tea with a silver spoon that chimed faintly against the porcelain. But there's something you should know, she continued, her gaze sharpening. His son, your Uncle Charles, has no idea you exist in any legal capacity. He assumes the trust flows solely to him and his children. And Charles, well, Charles has never forgiven your mother for shamming the family name. If he finds out Harold has reinstated you, he'll fight it. Hard. I swallowed. The warmth of the tea did nothing to thaw the sudden chill in my chest. So it wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The paper in my hands was proof, but proof means nothing without protection, without validation. Aunt Eleanor must have seen the fear flicker across my face, because she reached out and placed her hand over mine. Her skin was paper thin, mapped with blue veins, but her grip was steady. You're not alone in this, Isla, she said. I've stood by while this family chose money over mercy too many times. This time, I choose you. In that moment, her words weren't just comfort, they were corroboration. Elderally validation, not born of sentimentality, but of moral clarity. She wasn't just confirming the document's authenticity, she was anchoring my truth in the bedrock of someone who'd seen it all. And with that anchoring came both strength and warning. The road ahead wouldn't be quiet. But for the first time in my life, I wasn't walking it unseen. I didn't sleep that night. Not really. I lay on my narrow bed, the notarized addendum propped on my chest like a talisman, the streetlight outside casting long shadows that danced across the ceiling like ghosts packing. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw my grandfather's hands, those same hands that once signed merger agreements worth millions, now trembling as they offered me half an orange. And I heard Aunt Eleanor's warning echoing in the quiet. Charles will fight it. By dawn, I knew what I had to do. Not for the money, though God knew we needed it, but for the record, for my mother's name, for the truth. I dressed in my one good blouse, the one I wore for job interviews, and took the bus downtown again. But this time, I wasn't riding to work. I was riding to evidence. The county probate records office was tucked into the back corner of the municipal courthouse. A fluorescent lit room that smelled of aging paper, toner, and the quiet desperation of people trying to prove they existed in the eyes of the law. A clerk with tired eyes and a name tag that read M. Trent glanced up as I approached. "Help you?" she asked, already tapping at her keyboard. "I need to verify a trust amendment," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "For Harold Winthrop." She raised an eyebrow. "You a beneficiary?" "I believe so," I replied, "but I need proof." She didn't ask for more. Just typed, clicked, waited. The printer hummed to life in the corner like a mechanical heartbeat. When she handed me the page, I nearly dropped it. There it was, the Winthrop Family Revocable Trust, Amendment 7, filed 6 weeks ago. My name, Isla Winthrop Ramos, listed clearly under residual beneficiaries, with a 40% interest allocation. Below it, the notary seal, the filing timestamp, the clerk's initials. I took out my phone, hands only slightly shaking, and photographed the document from 3 angles. Front, close-up of the signature line, and the full page with the courthouse header visible. I checked the metadata. April 12, 2025, 10:43 a.m. Then I pulled out the bus receipt from Tuesday morning, timestamped 7:18 a.m., seat 14, and laid it beside the printout. 2 pieces of a puzzle that together formed a timeline. He sought me out after the amendment was filed. This wasn't a deathbed whim. It was a deliberate act. That receipt, this paper, wasn't just proof he'd changed his mind. It was proof he'd taken concrete, legal steps to make amends. Receipt number 1. But as I stood on the courthouse steps, the sun finally breaking through the clouds, I made a mistake. A human one, I thought. Maybe if I just talk to him, if Uncle Charles sees I'm not here to take everything, just to claim what was promised, he'll understand. So I called the number Aunt Alina had given me for the family estate office. A secretary answered. I gave my name. There was a pause, too long then, 1 moment. When Charles came on the line, his voice was polished ice. "Isla who?" he asked, as if my hyphenated name was a joke. I explained who I was, where I'd come from, that I'd met my grandfather, that I had documentation. He laughed, not loudly, but with the kind of condescending amusement people reserve for telemarketers and delusional strangers. "You must be confused," he said smoothly. "My father hasn't been coherent in months. And as for any amendments, well, we'll be reviewing all filings with our legal team. Don't bother calling again." The line went dead. I stood there on the steps, the printed page fluttering in my hand, the bus receipt crumpling in my fist. Shame burned in my throat, not shame for me, but for him, for the ease with which he dismissed a lifetime of absence as if it were nothing more than a clerical error. But in that moment, something hardened inside me. I wasn't the invisible niece anymore. I was the woman with receipts, and I wouldn't be erased, not by silence, not by scorn, not by someone who'd never even bothered to learn my mother's middle name. I walked back to the bus stop, tucked both documents into my bag, and made a silent promise. If they wanted a paper trail, I'd give them one they couldn't ignore. And this This quiet printout from a county office was only the beginning. The walls of my apartment felt closer than usual that week, like the plaster was breathing in, pressing down on my shoulders with every passing hour. My sister's tuition deadline loomed like a storm cloud, and the email from my landlord sat unread in my inbox for 3 days because I already knew what it said. Rent is 14 days late. Please contact us immediately to avoid eviction proceedings. I kept replaying Charles's voice on the phone, so calm, so certain of his power, while my own hands shook trying to choose between paying the electric bill or buying groceries. It was a cruel kind of irony. I held legal proof that I was owed a share of a fortune, yet I couldn't afford to replace the light bulb in the hallway. Then came the call from the hospital. Not for me, a patient I'd cared for the night before had coded during morning rounds, and as their designated nurse, I was asked to come in early for the debrief. I arrived at 6 a.m., still wearing yesterday's scrubs, my eyes gritty from lack of sleep, my mind split between grief for a life lost and panic over a life barely holding together. By the time my shift ended at 2 p.m., I was running on fumes and vending machine coffee, my feet aching, my spirit frayed at the edges like an old sweater. And just as I stepped off the bus near my apartment, my phone buzzed, a notification from my bank. Account alert, overdraft protection activated. I stopped dead on the sidewalk, the numbers on the screen blurred. There wasn't even enough to cover the $35 fee. I leaned against a lamppost, the cold metal biting through my thin jacket, and closed my eyes. For the first time in years, I let myself cry, not with sobs, but with silent, hot tears that traced paths down my cheeks and disappeared into my collar. This wasn't just about money. It was about dignity, about wondering if fighting for what was mine was worth the toll it was taking on everything else I'd built. But the universe, it seemed, wasn't done with me yet. That same afternoon, while I sat at the kitchen table staring blankly at a stack of overdue bills, my neighbor Mrs. Chen knocked softly on my door. She was in her late 70s, a retired seamstress with eyes that missed nothing, and a habit of leaving tins of almond cookies on my doorstep when she sensed I was struggling. Today, she didn't offer cookies. She held out a manila envelope, slightly yellowed at the edges. "I kept these," she said simply, her voice soft with the lilt of her native Cantonese. "For your mother, then for you." Inside were 10 years worth of utility bills for the old house on Sycamore, the one my grandfather still owned, the one my mother and I had lived in until we were forced out after Dad's death. Every bill was addressed to Catherine Winthrop Ramos, but the payment stubs, photocopied, neatly clipped, showed transfers from my bank account. Starting when I was 19. Every month, for heat in winter, for water during summer droughts, for keeping the lights on in a home that wasn't even mine anymore, just because I couldn't bear to let it fall into disrepair. "I saw you at the post office," she said gently, always paying, never complaining. Even when you were in nursing school, even after your mother passed, I thought someone should remember. I couldn't speak. I just clutched the envelope like it was a lifeline, which, in a way, it was. This wasn't just proof I'd contributed. It was proof I'd cared when no one else did. Receipt number 2. But while this stack of paper gave me moral weight, it didn't stop the eviction notice that arrived the next morning, slipped under my door in a stark white envelope with bold red lettering. And it didn't stop the call I got from the hospital HR department later that day. Due to budget reallocations, my department was facing temporary furloughs. My name was on the list. 2 pressures crashing at once, financial ruin on one side, professional instability on the other. And in the middle, me, holding receipts that felt heavier than hope. Defeated, I did the only thing I could think of. I went to the estate. Not to confront, not to demand, but just to see. Maybe if I stood at the gates, maybe if I caught a glimpse of the garden my mother once loved, I'd find the strength to keep going. But the guard at the wrought iron gate barely glanced at me before shaking his head. "No visitors without prior approval," he said flatly. "Especially not you." The way he said it, like he knew exactly who I was, like I was a known threat, cut deeper than I expected. I turned away, shoulders hunched against the wind, and walked the half-mile back to the bus stop in silence. And that's when I saw it. On the bench where I always waited, sitting perfectly centered, was another paper bag. Not crumpled this time, neatly folded at the top, tied with twine. Inside, 6 perfect Valencia oranges, cool to the touch, their skins gleaming in the late afternoon sun. No note, just the fruit, just the gesture. I picked it up slowly, heart pounding, because I knew he had sent it. Through his driver, through Aunt Alina, through some quiet channel I didn't understand. He hadn't spoken. He hadn't promised anything. But he'd seen me. Again. And in that moment, standing on a cold sidewalk with oranges in one hand and a stack of unpaid bills in the other, I realized something crucial. I didn't need his money to be worthy. But I did need his acknowledgement to be whole. And if he was willing to reach across the years one more time, then maybe, just maybe, I could fight not just for what was legally mine, but for the peace my mother never got to have. Aunt Alina didn't believe in half measures. When I called her that evening, voice thick with exhaustion, clutching the oranges like a talisman, she didn't offer platitudes. She said, "Be at the county clerk's office tomorrow at 10 a.m. Tell them you're meeting Mr. Winthrop and his legal representative. Wear your good blouse again." Then she hung up. No explanation. Just the quiet certainty of someone who'd spent a lifetime moving chess pieces from the shadows. I arrived 20 minutes early, heart hammering against my ribs, the manila envelope with Mrs. Chen's bills tucked under my arm like armor. The clerk's office was quieter today, just the hum of computers and the occasional rustle of paper. I sat on a hard plastic chair, watching the clock tick toward 10, wondering if this was another dead end, another polite dismissal wrapped in bureaucratic velvet. Then the doors opened. 2 men wheeled in a hospital-grade transport chair. In it sat my grandfather, wrapped in a navy wool blanket, his face pale but alert, his eyes locking onto mine the moment he entered. Behind him walked a woman in a tailored charcoal suit, sharp haircut, calm demeanor, a leather folio in hand. She nodded at me as she approached. "Ms. Winthrop Ramos, I'm Lillian Cho, your grandfather's estate attorney. He's asked me to facilitate today's verification." I stood, suddenly aware of how small I must look in this room of marble floors and institutional authority. But then he reached out his hand thin, veins like rivers under parchment, and I took it without hesitation. His grip was weak, but his gaze was fierce. "You came," he whispered. "We're here to execute a notarized affidavit of intent," Ms. Cho explained, already setting up documents on the clerk's desk. Per probate code section 8120, in cases of contested beneficiary designation, in-person confirmation with 2 disinterested witnesses constitutes legal verification of testamentary intent. 2 clerks, both women, both strangers, were summoned. They stood silently as Ms. Cho read the affidavit aloud. It stated clearly that Harold Winthrop, of sound mind and free will, affirmed that Isla Winthrop Ramos was his granddaughter, that he recognized her contributions to the family legacy through care of the Sycamore property, and that he intended for her to receive her designated share of the trust, per Amendment 7. Then, with slow, deliberate movements, he signed his name. The clerks signed as witnesses. The notary called in specially stamped, sealed, and dated the document right there on the spot. And then, because Ms. Cho had clearly anticipated resistance, she turned to me and said, "With your permission, I'd like to record a brief statement from your grandfather confirming his intent. For the probate file, it's admissible evidence." I nodded, throat tight. She pressed record on her phone. "State your name and date of birth," she prompted. "Harold James Winthrop," he said, voice raspy but clear. "Born June 3, 1936. And do you recognize Isla Winthrop Ramos?" He turned to me, eyes glistening. "She's my Catherine's daughter, my blood, my regret, and my redemption." The room seemed to still. "That's enough," Ms. Cho said softly, stopping the recording. She handed me a printed copy of the affidavit, then the digital file on a small USB drive. "This is receipt number 2, she said quietly. "But it won't protect you unless we lock the door behind it." That afternoon, from the law library downtown, where I sat with a borrowed laptop and a cup of terrible coffee, I filed a formal notice of interest with the probate court. It was a legal mechanism I'd read about in late-night research spirals, a way to stake a claim early, freeze asset distribution, and force transparency. Ms. Cho had walked me through it over the phone. "Once this is filed," she said, "no executor can liquidate, transfer, or alter trust assets without notifying you and obtaining court approval. It's your shield." I hit submit. The confirmation email arrived instantly. Notice of interested party. Case P202504892. Filed. I sat back, breathing deeply for the first time in weeks. This wasn't just about oranges, or old bills, or even inheritance. This was about leverage, lawful, documented, and irrefutable. I wasn't begging for a seat at the table anymore. I'd just filed the paperwork that proved I'd already been assigned one. And somewhere in his mansion on Cypress Hill, my Uncle Charles would soon get a certified letter he couldn't laugh away. Because the law doesn't care about family myths. It only cares about what's written and who showed up to sign it. The invitation arrived on a thick ivory card, embossed with the Winthrop crest, a detail I hadn't seen since childhood, back when such things still mattered in our household. Family brunch to discuss Harold's care and estate transition, it read, in elegant script that felt more like a summons than a suggestion. Date, Sunday. Time, 11 a.m. Location, Cypress Hill Estate. RSVP to Charles. No plus ones. I almost didn't go. Part of me wanted to send the affidavit and the trust amendment via courier. Let them choke on the paperwork over their eggs Benedict. But Aunt Alina's voice echoed in my mind. Truth isn't just proven in courtrooms, Isla. Sometimes it has to be witnessed at the table. So I went. I wore a simple navy dress, nothing flashy, nothing borrowed from the past. Just clean lines, steady shoes, and the manila folder tucked under my arm like a quiet promise. The gates opened automatically this time. The guard didn't meet my eyes as I walked past. The driveway curved through manicured gardens that my mother once tended as a girl, her hands stained with soil and hope. Now, white linen tents dotted the lawn, and silver trays gleamed under crystal chandeliers hung from tree branches, a grotesque parody of intimacy. Inside the sunroom, the family gathered like actors in a play none of them had rehearsed. My Uncle Charles stood near the buffet, holding a mimosa, laughing with his son, my cousin Julian, who'd once shoved me into a hedge at a family reunion and called me the help. Two aunts I barely recognized sipped tea, their smiles tight with practiced neutrality. And in the center of it all sat my grandfather, propped in a wingback chair, wearing a cashmere sweater the color of storm clouds, his face drawn but watchful. No one acknowledged me when I entered. Not at first. Charles gave a curt nod, as if I were a delivery person who'd arrived late. Julian smirked. The others pretended I was part of the wallpaper. They were deep in discussion, nursing home options, trust liquidity, protecting the legacy, as if my grandfather were already gone, as if his fortune were a pie to be divvied before the oven even cooled. Charles gestured grandly toward a glossy brochure. The Marigold Estates has a private wing. Discreet, secure, perfect for, well, you know. That's when I stepped forward. The room didn't fall silent all at once. It was more like a ripple, the kind that starts when a stone hits water. First, Charles stopped mid-sentence. Then his wife's teacup clinked too loudly against its saucer. Julian turned, eyes narrowing. Even my grandfather leaned forward slightly, his knuckles whitening on the armrest. "I'm sorry to interrupt," I said, my voice calm, clear, carrying just enough to be heard without shouting. "But before you decide where my grandfather spends his final months, you should know he's already decided something far more important." I opened the folder. "I've been named a 40% residual beneficiary of the Winthrop Revocable Trust per Amendment 7, filed 6 weeks ago, and verified in person with 2 neutral witnesses and a notarized affidavit." I placed the documents on the glass-topped table right beside the silver butter knife and the untouched croissants. "And for the record, he's not moving to Marigold. He's staying home, with dignity." Charles laughed, a sharp, brittle sound. "That's absurd. Father hasn't been lucid enough to sign a grocery list, let alone a trust amendment." But before I could respond, the family attorney, Mr. Holloway, a man who'd handled Winthrop affairs for 30 years, stepped forward. He'd been standing near the potted ferns, silent until now. He picked up the affidavit, scanned it, then checked the notary seal against a digital ledger on his phone. After a long pause, he looked up. "These documents appear valid," he said quietly. "The signatures match. The witnesses are county clerks with no familial ties, and the filing timestamp aligns with Mr. Winthrop's medical records. He was discharged from cardiac rehab the day before." The room froze. Charles's face went slack. Julian dropped his fork. One of the aunts gasped, not in shock, but in something closer to relief, as if a truth she'd long suspected had finally been spoken aloud. And my grandfather, he didn't smile. He didn't gloat. He simply reached out a trembling hand toward mine. And for the first time in my life, in front of everyone who'd ever made me feel invisible, I took it. This wasn't about money. It was about presence. And in that sun-drenched room, surrounded by the ghosts of silence and the living architects of exclusion, I was no longer a rumor. I was real, and I was finally, undeniably, seated at the table. The brunch ended not with a bang, but with a slow, suffocating retreat, silverware set down too carefully. Chairs scraped back with exaggerated politeness, murmured excuses about prior engagements. Charles didn't look at me again. He simply walked out, jaw clenched, phone already pressed to his ear, no doubt calling his own lawyer to dismantle what he couldn't deny. The others drifted away like leaves after a storm, casting glances that mixed curiosity, guilt, and something uncomfortably close to awe. Only Aunt Alina remained, standing by the French doors, a small nod of quiet pride passing between us like a secret handshake. But I wasn't done. A week later, I returned to Cypress Hill, not for brunch, not for negotiation, but for reckoning. This time, I requested a formal family meeting in the library, the very room where my grandfather once told my mother she'd dishonored the Winthrop name by marrying my father. The same room where oil portraits of stern ancestors glared down from gilded frames, as if still keeping score. They all came, even Charles, maybe out of obligation, maybe out of fear, or maybe because, for the first time, he sensed the ground shifting beneath his feet. I didn't sit. I stood at the head of the long mahogany table, the same one where generations of Winthrops had signed contracts, divided fortunes, and broken hearts. In my hands, I held a single sheet of paper, not a legal document, but something far more intimate. I found this in a locked drawer of my mother's writing desk after she died. I began, my voice steady despite the tremor in my hands. She never sent it. Maybe she hoped, one day, she wouldn't need to. But I think she wrote it for me as much as for him. I took a breath, then I read, "Dear Father Asterisk, I don't write to ask for forgiveness. You never believed I needed it. Nor do I write to plead. I'm your daughter, not a petitioner. But I am writing to say this. I loved him, not despite his modest means, but because of his kindness. And I love our child more than I ever feared your disapproval. You taught me that legacy is built on stone, on names, on wealth, on control. But I've learned it's built on something far more fragile, presence. And in choosing to erase us, you didn't protect the Winthrop name. You hollowed it out. I don't hate you. I grieve you. The father who held me when I skinned my knee. The man who brought me oranges every spring, as if sweetness could outlast silence. If you ever read this, know that I kept your oranges. And I taught Isla to peel them slowly, just like you did, with love that never stopped. Catherine, the room was utterly still. Even the grandfather clock in the corner seemed to hold its chime. Then I turned to my grandfather, who sat wrapped in his blanket, tears tracing slow paths down his cheeks. She never sent it, I said softly, but I think she wanted you to hear it anyway. And then, because paper alone wouldn't be enough, I played the recording. Miss Joe had given me a copy, the one from the clerk's office. His voice, thin but unwavering. She's my Catherine's daughter, my blood, my regret, and my redemption. As it played, something broke open in that room, not with noise, but with weight. One of my aunts began to cry quietly into her handkerchief. Julian stared at the floor, his usual smirk gone. Even Charles looked shaken not by the legal threat, but by the human one, the undeniable proof that his father's heart had never truly belonged to the empire he'd built. Then came the final blow. I placed a third document on the table, a certified copy of the court's preliminary acknowledgement of my notice of interest, stamped and sealed. The probate court has officially recognized my standing, I said. Any attempt to contest the amendment will now require full discovery, including financial records, prior communications, and witness depositions, including yours, Charles. He opened his mouth to protest, to bluster. But Mr. Holloway, the family attorney, spoke first. "He's right," he said quietly, adjusting his glasses. And given the clarity of the affidavit and the timing of the amendment, a challenge would not only fail, it could trigger penalties for frivolous litigation. The truth wasn't shouted. It was laid out in handwriting, in voice, in law, and it left no room for denial. Public accountability wasn't about vengeance. It was about restoration, about making sure the story wasn't rewritten one last time by the people who'd benefited from the silence. And as I stood there, flanked by the ghosts of my mother's love and my grandfather's regret, I realized something profound. I hadn't come to claim an inheritance. I'd come to reclaim the narrative. And for the first time in 23 years, the Winthrop name would carry not just wealth, but truth. 3 weeks later, the court's ruling arrived not with fanfare, but with the quiet finality of a gavel falling in an empty chamber. I was sitting at my kitchen table, still the same cramped apartment, though the eviction notice had been rescinded after I showed my landlord the preliminary court acknowledgement when the email popped up in my inbox. Subject line: In re Winthrop Family Revocable Trust, case number P202-504892. Final order of validation. I opened it slowly, as if the screen might shatter from the weight of what it contained. There, in crisp legal prose, was the verdict. Harold Winthrop's Amendment 7 was upheld in full. Isla Winthrop Ramos was confirmed as a 40% residual beneficiary of the trust. All prior challenges, filed hastily by Charles just days after the library meeting, were dismissed for lack of standing and insufficient evidence of undue influence. The judge even noted, with dry understatement, that the testator's intent was corroborated by multiple independent witnesses and contemporaneous documentation. I didn't cry. Not then. I just sat very still, my fingers tracing the words on the screen like braille, as if I needed to feel them to believe them. But the real victory came the next morning. At 9 a.m., a county sheriff's deputy, uniform crisp, badge gleaming, arrived at Cypress Hill with a sealed envelope. Not for me, for Charles. It was the court's formal notice. Any further attempts to interfere with trust administration would be treated as contempt. More than that, the court had mandated that all liquid assets be transferred into a newly formed, court-supervised investment vehicle, jointly managed by Mr. Holloway, and an independent fiduciary approved by the probate judge. Charles could no longer move money, sell properties, or restructure the estate without my knowledge or consent. For the first time in his life, he had to ask permission. I heard the details from Aunt Alina over tea that afternoon. She told me Charles had stormed out of the estate that day, slamming the garage door so hard it cracked the stucco. He tried to fire Mr. Holloway, but the attorney simply handed him a copy of his own retainer agreement, signed years ago, which stipulated that in matters of contested succession, his duty was to the court, not to any single heir. "He's furious," she said, stirring honey into her cup, "but powerless. And that, my dear, is a rare thing in our family." Later that week, I visited my grandfather in the sunroom, where he now spent most of his days. Wrapped in the same navy blanket, sunlight pooling around him like a halo. He was weaker, his voice barely above a whisper, but his eyes were clear. "It's done," I told him, sitting on the ottoman beside his chair, taking his hand in mine. He squeezed it once, gently, and nodded. No grand speech, no dramatic confession, just a quiet exhale, as if a burden he'd carried for decades had finally been set down. That evening, I returned to the house on Sycamore, the one I'd paid to keep warm all those years. With the court order in hand, I met the locksmith at the front gate. A new deadbolt was installed, the old key turned for the last time. And when I stepped inside, the air smelled of dust and memory and something else. Peace. I stood in the foyer where my mother had taught me to twirl in a yellow dress, where my father had played piano late into the night, where silence had once been weaponized against us. Now, I turned the key in the new lock, not as an act of possession, but of protection. This wasn't just a house anymore. It was testament. The lawful reversal hadn't come with fireworks or headlines. It came with stamped paper, court seals, and the slow, steady turning of institutional gears. But in that quiet victory, something far more valuable than money had been restored. The right to be seen, acknowledged, and honored, not because I fought like a lion, but because I refused to disappear like a ghost. And as I stood on the porch that night, key in hand, the orange tree in the side yard heavy with fruit, I knew my mother would have smiled. Not because I'd won, but because I'd done it with her name intact and mine, finally, unerased. The fallout wasn't loud. It never is in families like ours. There were no shouting matches, no tabloid headlines, no public disownments. Instead, the consequences unfolded like slow-moving tectonic plates. Silent, inevitable, reshaping the landscape beneath everyone's feet without a single dramatic quake. Charles didn't attend the next board meeting of the Winthrop Family Foundation. When his absence was noted, Mr. Holloway simply said, he stepped back from active governance, and no one pressed further. Within 2 months, he'd sold his minority stake in the textile holdings. The part of the empire he'd always bragged was pure Winthrop blood, to a private equity firm. Not at a loss, but not at the premium he'd once assumed he'd command, either. I heard through Aunt Alina that he'd moved into a sleek high-rise downtown, far from the sprawling estate that had once been his birthright. He didn't call. He didn't write. And in his silence, I found a strange kind of mercy. He'd chosen exile over humiliation, and I didn't begrudge him that dignity. 2 of my cousins, Julian's younger sister, Mara, and my mother's godson, Daniel, reached out separately, months later. Mara sent a handwritten note. I was too young to understand what happened back then, but I'm old enough now to be ashamed. I didn't question it. Daniel showed up at my clinic during a slow shift, holding 2 coffees, and said simply, I should have stood up for you at that reunion. I was scared of my dad, but I'm not anymore. We didn't rekindle a childhood friendship. We built something new, tentative, cautious, but honest. That was enough. The family WhatsApp group, the one once filled with passive-aggressive birthday wishes and photos of yachts, quietly dissolved. Some members started a new thread without me. Others never joined it. I didn't care. I'd spent years trying to prove I belonged in a circle that only valued me as an absence. Now, I'd rather sit alone in a room full of light than in a gilded hall full of ghosts. As for the inheritance itself, it wasn't a windfall I splurged on. It was a responsibility I honored. A portion went into a scholarship fund in my mother's name, awarded annually to nursing students from underrepresented backgrounds. Another secured my sister's full tuition. No more sleepless nights over bills. No more choosing between textbooks and groceries. And a third became the down payment on a modest home, not the estate on Cypress Hill, but a 2-story craftsman with a porch swing and a backyard where I could plant orange trees. The money didn't change who I was, but it did give me something I'd never had before, the luxury of peace. No more double shifts. No more dread when the phone rang. No more calculating whether a doctor's visit was worth the copay. Just space to breathe, to heal, to remember my mother without the constant hum of survival buzzing in my ears. What surprised me most, though, wasn't the shift in my circumstances. It was the messages that began appearing in my inbox from strangers. A woman in Ohio who'd been cut off after marrying outside her faith. A man in Texas fighting to be recognized as his grandfather's heir after decades of estrangement. They wrote not for money or advice, but for one thing. You gave me the courage to check my own deed. That's when I realized the true ripple of what had happened. This wasn't just my story. It was a signal flare in the dark for everyone who'd been told their pain was too quiet to matter, their claim too small to pursue. Legal justice doesn't roar, it documents. It files. It shows up with receipts and walks away with boundaries. And sometimes that's more powerful than any revenge. The fallout wasn't fire. It was frost, slow, clarifying, revealing the shape of things once hidden by heat and noise. And in that clarity, I found something I hadn't known I was missing. The freedom to move forward, unburdened by the weight of someone else's pride. 6 months after the court's final order, an envelope arrived in my mailbox with no return address, just my name, written in a hand I didn't recognize. Inside was a single sheet of letterhead from a downtown law firm I'd never heard of, but the signature at the bottom stopped my breath. Charles Winthrop. He hadn't signed it Uncle. He hadn't written Dear Isla. Just a formal, almost clinical letter titled Asterisk, Notice of Non-Contestation, and Acknowledgement of Beneficiary Status. In 3 short paragraphs, he stated that he would no longer challenge my designation as a trust beneficiary, that he acknowledged the validity of Amendment 7, and that he waived all future claims to administrative control over the Sycamore property. At the bottom, in neat script, this acknowledgement is made without admission of fault, but with recognition of familial fact. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't even kindness. But it was something I hadn't expected. Surrender wrapped in civility. I showed it to Aunt Alina over tea. She read it twice, then set it down with a sigh that carried the weight of decades. "He's not doing this for you," she said quietly. "He's doing it for himself, to salvage what's left of his reputation before the board votes on the foundation's new charter." She paused, stirring her tea. But it's still a choice. And choices, however late, still count. That night, I sat at my kitchen table, the same one where I'd once spread out overdue bills, like a map of my despair, and drafted my reply. Not a letter. A formal addendum to the family foundation's bylaws, which I'd been invited to help revise. In it, I proposed a new clause. All historical board members, including those no longer active, shall retain honorary recognition on the legacy plaque in the foundation hall, provided they do not engage in active contestation of current beneficiaries or governance decisions. I sent it to Mr. Holloway with a note. Let his name stay. Not because he deserves it, but because erasure isn't the lesson I want this family to learn. Grace with conditions isn't forgiveness handed out like candy. It's architecture. It's saying, you can exist in this space, but only if you agree to the blueprint. I didn't invite Charles to board meetings. I didn't seek his counsel. But I also didn't scrub his name from the past. The plaque would bear his signature alongside my mother. A silent testament to the truth that families are built not just by love, but by contradiction, and sometimes by the quiet decision not to burn the whole house down just to punish one person for locking the door. Months later, I passed him in the corridor of the probate courthouse during a routine trust review. He was with his attorney, briefcase in hand, looking older than I remembered. Our eyes met just for a second, and neither of us spoke. But he didn't look away. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. Not friendship, not reconciliation, but acknowledgement. And in that moment, I understood. Grace isn't about restoring what was broken. It's about refusing to become the kind of person who breaks others just because they were broken themselves. My mother taught me to peel oranges slowly, to savor the sweetness beneath the rind. Now, I was learning to do the same with people with memory, with legacy, with the complicated, flawed humanity of those who hurt us, and yet remain irrevocably part of our story. The empty chair at the foundation meetings. I left it there not as a threat, but as a boundary. A quiet reminder that presence must be earned, not inherited. And sometimes, the most powerful thing you can offer someone who spent a lifetime trying to control you is the chance to simply exist, without power, without apology, without noise, just as they are. I ride the 7:15 a.m. bus once a month now, not because I have to, but because I want to. It's my ritual, my way of honoring the morning that changed everything. I still sit in seat 14, the same spot where he placed that folded will between us, like an olive branch wrapped in legal paper. And every time, without fail, I bring a paper bag of Valencia oranges, 6 of them, just like the ones he left on the bench that cold afternoon after I'd been turned away from the estate. The bus smells different now, or maybe I just notice more. The coffee is still bitter, the wool coat's still damp, the overhead lights still flicker. But there's a quiet hum of possibility beneath it all, because I know now that miracles don't always arrive with sirens and spotlights. Sometimes they show up in worn caps and paper bags on rainy Tuesdays in the space between 2 strangers who turn out to be family. The house on Sycamore is mine, not just on the deed, which now hangs framed in the front hall beside my nursing license, but in the way the floorboards creak under my feet like they've been waiting for me to come home. I painted the kitchen, the soft sage green my mother always loved, but never got to choose. I planted 3 orange trees in the side yard, saplings now, but strong, their leaves catching the morning light like promises. And every Sunday, I set an extra place at the table, not for ghosts, but for the future, for the family I'm building, one honest conversation at a time. My grandfather passed 3 weeks after the court's final ruling. He'd been fatting for days, drifting in and out of sleep, his breath shallow but peaceful. I held his hand through the night, just as he'd held mine at that brunch. And when the end came, it was quiet, like a sigh finally released after a lifetime of holding it in. At the funeral, I didn't stand in the back. I stood beside Aunt Alina at the front, in a simple black dress, while Charles lingered near the edge of the crowd, hat in hand, eyes downcast. No words passed between us. None were needed. The truth had already been spoken in court, in letters, in the quiet courage of showing up. The motif of oranges, once a symbol of distance and coded regret, has become something else entirely. Now it's a choice. I give them freely to my sister's college friends, to my patients during flu season, to the little girl who lives next door and knocks on my door just to ask about the trees. I never attach conditions. I never say, remember where this came from. I just offer half a peeled orange with a smile, the way he did on that bus. Because generosity, untethered from expectation, is the purest form of healing. From invisible granddaughter to verified heir, the journey wasn't about reclaiming wealth. It was about reclaiming worth. And worth, I've learned, isn't measured in trusts or titles or timber-framed estates. It's measured in the moments you choose to stay when walking away would be easier. In the receipts you keep not to punish, but to protect. In the quiet dignity of saying, I am here. I have always been here, and I will not be erased again. The windows in this house are always open now, letting in the breeze, the birdsong, the golden light that used to be blocked by heavy drapes drawn shut against the world. And every morning, as I unlock the front door with the key that once felt like a relic, I whisper the same words to myself, not as a plea, but as a promise. This is mine, and I am enough. There's a quiet power in knowing your truth doesn't need permission to exist. For so long, I thought justice had to be loud, shouted from courthouses, splashed across headlines, demanded with clenched fists. But what I learned in those months of bus rides, bank records, and notarized letters is this: real justice is often whispered. It's filed. It's time-stamped. It's carried in a paper bag like an offering, not a weapon. If you've been told your story is too small, too old, or too quiet to matter, if you've been erased from a will, a family, a legacy simply because you didn't fit someone else's narrative, please hear this. Documentation is your ally. Silence is not consent. And your worth was never for them to decide. I say this not as someone who had everything, but as someone who had almost nothing except receipts, resilience, and one elderly neighbor who saved my utility bills just in case. If you're facing an inheritance dispute, a contested will, or estrangement wrapped in legal ambiguity, don't navigate it alone. Reach out to a civil or probate attorney. Many offer free initial consultations, and some work on sliding scale fees or pro bono for cases involving elder abuse or unjust disinheritance. You don't need a mansion to have rights. You just need proof and the courage to show up with it. Since that day on the bus, I've heard from hundreds of you through comments, DMs, even handwritten letters slipped under my clinic door. Stories of grandparents who left secret trusts, siblings who forged documents, cousins who froze accounts for your own good. Each one a variation on the same theme. I was told I didn't belong, but I had the papers. You've reminded me that this story was never just mine. It was a signal flare, and you answered it with your own truth. So thank you for trusting me with your silence, for turning your pain into proof, for believing, even when no one else did, that you deserved to be seen. This chapter of my life has closed, but another is already unfolding. I've begun volunteering with a legal aid coalition that helps estranged heirs, particularly women and minorities, navigate probate systems that often favor the loudest voice, not the rightful one. And in the quiet hours, I'm compiling a resource guide. How to protect your inheritance when family won't, with templates for affidavits, checklists for verifying trust documents, and a list of elder ally attorneys by state. If you'd like early access, leave a note below. Not for drama, not for spectacle, but for solidarity. Because legacy isn't just what's left behind in a will. It's what we build from the rubble of silence. It's the orange you peel slowly, the key you turn with care, the truth you file before it's too late. And if you ever find yourself on a bus beside someone who looks like a stranger, but carries your history in their hands, don't look away. Lean in. You might just find your way home.